My name is Ethan, 38 years old, and for the better part of the last decade, I've been a ghost to my family. Not by choice, mind you. They made sure of that. It was a cold November night, much like tonight as I sit here telling you this, when they slammed the door on me, both literally and figuratively. The reason? Well, according to them, I was an embarrassment, a black sheep in their otherwise pristine white flock. My sin? Daring to dream bigger than the small town we grew up in, wanting more than the predictable life they had mapped out for me. Looking back, maybe I was naive. Maybe I should have seen it coming. My parents, bless their hearts, though sometimes I really question that blessing, were creatures of habit and tradition. My older brother, Daniel, was their golden boy, the one who towed the line, married the right girl, and climbed the corporate ladder exactly as they had envisioned. And then there was me, the wild card, the one who wanted to travel, to start my own business, to live life on my own terms. That didn't sit well. Not at all. The final blow came when I turned down a perfectly good, according to them, job offer at Daniel's company. I had my own plans, a startup I was pouring my heart and soul into. They saw it as an insult, a rejection of everything they stood for. The argument that night was brutal. Words were thrown around like knives. And when I refused to back down, my dad, his face red with anger, told me to get out. My mom just stood there, silent, a look of disappointment etched on her face that cut deeper than any shouting. Daniel, ever the loyal son, just nodded in agreement. So I left, with a backpack full of clothes, a few $100s in my bank account, and a heart heavier than I care to admit. I didn't look back. Pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe a little bit of both, kept me from reaching out. And they? Well, they didn't exactly flood my phone with calls, or show up at my doorstep begging for forgiveness. In their world, I had made my choice and they had made theirs. Years passed. I built my business from the ground up. There were struggles, setbacks, moments when I thought I would have to give up. But I persevered. I worked day and night, fueled by a burning desire to prove them wrong, to show them that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. And somewhere along the way, I actually started to succeed. My little startup grew, slowly but surely, into a thriving company. I wasn't a millionaire, not yet anyway, but I was comfortable, independent, and, dare I say, happy. I had almost managed to completely block out my past, to pretend that the family who had cast me out didn't exist. Almost. Because then, about a month ago, I received an invitation. A fancy, embossed card informing me of Daniel's upcoming wedding to some woman named Olivia. Honestly, my first reaction was to toss it in the trash. Why would I want to witness my brother's perfect life, the life that was supposed to be mine if I had just played along? Why would I subject myself to the inevitable judgment and thinly veiled pity from my parents? But then, a little seed of curiosity started to sprout in my mind. It had been 10 years. 10 years since I last saw them, since I last set foot in that town. People change, right? Maybe they had changed. Maybe they had realized that their way wasn't the only way. Maybe, just maybe, they regretted how things had ended. I knew it was a long shot. I knew I was probably setting myself up for disappointment. But there was also a part of me, a stubborn, maybe even slightly vindictive part, that wanted to see them, to see how their perfect lives had turned out, to see if they even recognized the man I had become. So, against my better judgment, I RSVP'd. I even bought a new suit, something sharp and expensive that would have made my dad scoff back in the day. I booked a flight back to my hometown, a place I had sworn I would never return to. As the date drew closer, I started to feel a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. What would I say? What would they say? Would they even let me in the door? The wedding was being held at the town's fanciest country club, a place that was definitely a step up from the community hall where Daniel and his high school sweetheart had always said they would get married. That was the first sign that maybe things had changed more than I realized. As I pulled up to the valet, the place was buzzing with activity. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and guests in their finest attire were milling about, laughing and chatting. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. This was it. No turning back now. I handed my keys to the valet and made my way towards the entrance. The familiar small-town air, crisp and carrying the scent of pine, hit me, and a wave of memories, both good and bad, washed over me. I pushed them aside and focused on the task at hand: surviving this wedding. Inside, the scene was even more extravagant. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, floral arrangements the size of small cars adorned every corner, and a string quartet played softly in the background. It was the kind of wedding that screamed, "We have arrived." And I couldn't help but wonder how Daniel, the guy who used to clip coupons, could afford all this. I scanned the crowd, trying to spot a familiar face. It didn't take long. There they were, standing near the head of the room, looking every bit the proud parents of the groom. My mom, her hair perfectly coiffed, was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first car. My dad, looking a little heavier around the middle but still with that same stern expression, was shaking hands with some well-dressed guests. And then there was Daniel, beaming in his tuxedo, his arm around a stunning blonde woman I assumed was Olivia. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. Time to face the music. I started to make my way towards them, trying to look as nonchalant as possible, like I belonged there. But as I got closer, I noticed something. Something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Standing next to my mom, her back to me, was a woman I hadn't seen in years. My Aunt Carol, my mom's younger sister. Carol and I had always been close. She was the one who always encouraged my dreams, the one who told me to never let anyone dim my light. But about 5 years ago, she had a falling out with my parents. Something about a business deal gone wrong. They had a huge fight, and since then they hadn't spoken. I knew my mom was too stubborn to ever reach out, and I assumed Carol felt the same way. So what was she doing here? At Daniel's wedding? It didn't make sense. Unless something had happened. Something that had brought them back together. As I stood there, trying to figure out this new development, Carol turned around. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and a small gasp escaped her lips. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice filled with surprise. Before I could say anything, my mom turned as well. Her reaction was, well, it wasn't exactly the warm embrace I might have secretly hoped for. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold. The same tone she used when I had tracked mud into the house as a kid. Daniel and Olivia turned to see what the commotion was about. Daniel's face registered surprise, quickly followed by a look of mild annoyance. Olivia just looked confused. I was invited," I said, holding up the invitation I had tucked into my inside pocket. My mom scoffed. "Invited? By whom?" "By Daniel," I replied, looking at my brother for confirmation. Daniel hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Yeah, Mom. I sent him an invitation." "Why would you do that?" my mom demanded, her voice rising slightly, drawing the attention of a few nearby guests. "Well, he's my brother," Daniel said, his tone placating. It felt like the right thing to do. My dad, who had been observing the scene with a frown, finally stepped forward. "Ethan," he said, his voice gruff, "we weren't expecting you." "I figured," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was exactly as I had feared. They hadn't changed. They still saw me as the unwelcome outsider. But then, Carol stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. "It's good to see you, Ethan," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "It's been too long." Her simple gesture of kindness was like a balm to my frayed nerves. I smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. "It's good to see you too, Aunt Carol. I was surprised to see you here." She gave me a knowing look. "Things change, Ethan. Sometimes in unexpected ways." Her words hung in the air, a subtle hint that maybe there was more to this family reunion than met the eye. And just as I was about to ask her what she meant, Olivia, Daniel's seemingly perfect bride, stepped forward, a bright, albeit slightly strained, smile on her face. "Well, it's lovely to finally meet you, Ethan," she said, extending a hand. "Daniel has told me so much about you." Daniel shot her a quick, nervous glance. "All good things, I hope?" he added with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. I shook Olivia's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "I'm sure," I said, but something about her overly enthusiastic greeting felt a little off. The small crowd that had gathered to witness our awkward family reunion started to disperse as the string quartet began to play a more upbeat tune, signaling that it was almost time for the ceremony to begin. My parents, still looking less than thrilled about my presence, started to move towards their seats. "Come on, Ethan," Carol said, gently pulling me along. "Let's find a place to sit." As we walked towards the seating area, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect wedding. My aunt's cryptic comment, Olivia's slightly forced enthusiasm, my parents' obvious discomfort. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. We found seats near the back, and as we sat down, Carol turned to me, her expression serious. "Ethan," she said, her voice low, "there's something you need to know." My heart skipped a beat. Here it comes, I thought. The real reason she's here. The real reason things feel so strange. "What is it?" I asked, leaning in, my senses on high alert. Carol took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "Daniel's business. It's not as successful as everyone thinks." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's always bragging about how well he's doing. That's what he wants everyone to believe," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, the company is in serious trouble. He's been losing money for years. He's up to his eyeballs in debt." My jaw dropped. Daniel? The golden boy? Failing? It was hard to believe. "But how is he affording this wedding?" I asked, gesturing around at the opulent surroundings. Carol's expression turned grim. "That's the worst part, Ethan. He didn't pay for it. Olivia's family did." "Her family?" "Yes," Carol confirmed. "They're very wealthy. This wedding is basically a business transaction, a way for Daniel to secure his future." I stared at her, my mind reeling. So, the perfect life my brother had been flaunting was nothing but a carefully constructed facade. He was marrying for money, not love. And my parents? They must know. They must be in on it. A wave of anger washed over me. Anger at Daniel for his deception, anger at my parents for their complicity, and anger at myself for ever thinking that things might have changed. As the music swelled and the wedding ceremony began, I couldn't focus on the vows or the readings. My mind was racing, trying to process this new information. It explained so much: the extravagance of the wedding, Olivia's slightly artificial demeanor, the underlying tension in the air. But it also raised so many more questions. What exactly was Daniel's business? How bad were his financial problems? And what role did my parents play in all of this? I glanced over at them, sitting in the front row, their faces masks of pride and happiness. They looked so content, so sure of their perfect little world. Little did they know that world was about to come crashing down. And I had a feeling I was about to play a very big part in that crash. The ceremony ended, and the guests began to make their way to the reception area. Carol placed a hand on my arm again, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked a lot like anticipation. "Are you going to say something?" she asked, her voice barely audible amidst the chatter of the crowd. I looked at my brother, now beaming as he posed for pictures with his new bride. I looked at my parents, their faces radiating smug satisfaction. And then I looked at Carol, her gaze steady, almost daring me. A slow smile spread across my face. "Oh, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I'm going to say a lot of things. This perfect wedding was about to get a whole lot more interesting. And my family? They had no idea what was coming. The years of being the outcast, the black sheep, the disappointment. They were about to learn that the prodigal son had returned, and he wasn't here to beg for forgiveness. He was here for something else entirely, something they would never see coming." The reception was in full swing. The ballroom, even more dazzling under the soft glow of the evening lights, buzzed with the chatter of well-wishers. Champagne flowed freely, and waiters glided through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. It was the picture of celebratory bliss. The picture I was about to tear to shreds. Carol and I found a quiet corner near the bar. She looked at me, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "So," she said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "What's the plan?" I took a sip of my drink, the cool liquid doing little to quell the fire that was now burning inside me. "The plan, Aunt Carol, is to show everyone the truth." "And how exactly are you going to do that?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. "Remember how Daniel always used to brag about his business online? All those posts about success and making it big?" Carol nodded. "Vividly. It was always a bit much, even for me." "Well," I continued, a grim satisfaction creeping into my voice, "I did a little digging. Turns out those success stories were mostly smoke and mirrors. I have documents, emails, even some rather damning financial statements that paint a very different picture." Carol's eyes widened. "You have proof." "More than enough," I confirmed. "Proof that his company has been bleeding money for years. Proof of some questionable accounting practices. And proof that this lavish wedding is being bankrolled by Olivia's family to bail him out." "Wow," Carol breathed, shaking her head. "Your mother is going to have a conniption." "That's putting it mildly," I chuckled. "But this isn't just about embarrassing them. It's about exposing the truth. They all acted like I was the failure, the one who couldn't make it. Well, it turns out their golden boy is a house of cards waiting to collapse." The moment felt right. The speeches were about to begin. Daniel, looking smug and self-satisfied, stood at the microphone, tapping it lightly. My parents sat at the head table, beaming with pride. Olivia stood beside Daniel, a picture of radiant happiness. It was the perfect moment to drop the bomb. I nodded to Carol. "Let's go." We made our way towards the head table, weaving through the crowd. As we got closer, I could hear Daniel starting his speech, thanking everyone for coming and gushing about his beautiful bride. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through his saccharine words. Daniel stopped mid-sentence, his smile faltering as he saw me approaching. My parents' faces went from beaming to bewildered in a split second. Olivia looked like she wanted to disappear. "Ethan," Daniel stammered, a nervous edge creeping into his voice. "What are you doing?" "I just wanted to say a few words," I replied, my voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. My mom stood up, her face a mask of fury. "You were not invited to speak," she hissed. "Don't you dare ruin your brother's wedding." "Mom," I said, my gaze unwavering. "I think the truth is about to ruin his wedding all by itself." A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on us. Daniel looked like he was about to have a panic attack. Olivia's smile had completely vanished. "What are you talking about?" my dad demanded, his voice gruff. I took a step closer to the microphone, ignoring the death glares from my parents and the bewildered stares from the guests. "My brother Daniel has been telling everyone how successful he is, how his business is thriving. It's a great story. Too bad it's not true." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Daniel's face had gone white. Olivia gripped his arm tightly. "That's a lie," Daniel blurted out, his voice shaking. "Don't listen to him. He's just jealous." "Jealous?" I scoffed. "Jealous of what, Daniel? Your mountain of debt? Your failing company? Or maybe the fact that you had to marry for money because you couldn't make it on your own?" I could see the shock and confusion spreading through the guests. Murmurs broke out as people started whispering to each other. "How dare you?" my mom shrieked. "Get out of here. You're just trying to cause trouble." "Trouble?" I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I'm just bringing the truth to light. Something this family has always had a problem with." I pulled out my phone and held it up. "I have here documented proof of everything I'm saying. Financial records, emails, even a few rather interesting conversations Daniel had with his creditors." Daniel lunged towards me, trying to grab my phone, but I sidestepped him easily. "You wouldn't," he yelled, his face contorted with rage. "Oh, but I would," I said, my voice cold. You and this family have spent years painting me as the failure. Well, it's time everyone saw who the real failure is. I looked at Olivia, her eyes wide with fear and betrayal. Did you know, Olivia? Did you know that the man you just married is drowning in debt? That his entire image of success is a carefully constructed lie? Olivia didn't answer. She just stared at Daniel, her face pale and drawn. My dad stepped forward, his face red with anger. This is enough, Ethan. You're embarrassing us. Embarrassing you? I repeated, my voice rising. You want to talk about embarrassing? How about the fact that you disowned your own son for wanting to follow his dreams? How about the fact that you stood by and watched while Daniel built his entire life on a foundation of lies? The room was completely silent now. Every eye was on us. The carefully crafted facade of the perfect wedding, the perfect family, was crumbling before their very eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. Oh, I think you do, I said, my gaze locking with his. And I think everyone else here deserves to know the truth. I started to read excerpts from the documents on my phone, detailing Daniel's mounting debts, his shady business dealings, and the extent of his financial desperation. With each revelation, I could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the guests. Some gasped, others whispered in disbelief, and a few even started recording on their phones. Olivia stood frozen, her hand still gripping Daniel's arm, but her eyes were filled with a dawning horror. I could see the realization hitting her. She had been duped. My mom sank into her chair, her face buried in her hands. My dad stood there, his jaw clenched, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. When I finished reading, the silence in the room was deafening. Daniel looked like he was about to faint. Olivia slowly pulled her hand away from his arm, her expression a mixture of anger and disgust. Is this true, Daniel? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was hanging in the air, undeniable and damning. Olivia turned to her parents, who were standing nearby, their faces thunderous. You knew? She asked them, her voice trembling. Her father, a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, nodded grimly. We thought we could help him turn things around. Help him? Olivia cried, her voice rising. You let me marry a liar, a fraud. Tears started streaming down her face. She ripped off her wedding ring and threw it at Daniel's feet. I can't believe I married you, she sobbed, before turning and running out of the ballroom, her parents following close behind. The room erupted into chaos. Guests started talking at once, their voices a mixture of shock, outrage, and morbid curiosity. The perfect wedding had turned into a complete disaster. My parents finally found their voices, their anger directed squarely at me. Look what you've done, my mom shrieked. You've ruined everything. Ruined everything? I repeated, my voice calm amidst the storm. I just exposed the truth. You all were living a lie. And frankly, you had it coming. I looked at Daniel, who was standing there, pale and trembling, his perfect world shattered around him. Remember all those times you and Mom and Dad made me feel like I was worthless? Remember when you told me I would never amount to anything? Well, look at me now, Daniel. I may not have your fake success, but at least I built my life on honesty. Something you clearly know nothing about. I turned to my parents, their faces etched with fury and shame. And as for you too, maybe now you'll understand that judging your children based on your narrow-minded expectations isn't always the best approach. Maybe you'll learn that sometimes, the black sheep is the one who ends up being the most successful. I had said my piece. The truth was out. The carefully constructed facade had crumbled. And as I looked around at the wreckage, I felt a sense of satisfaction wash over me. It wasn't a joyful feeling, not exactly, but it was a feeling of closure, of finally standing up for myself after years of being made to feel inferior. Carol put a hand on my shoulder. Come on, Ethan, she said gently. Let's get out of here. I nodded, taking one last look at my family, their faces a mixture of anger, shame, and disbelief. Then, I turned and walked away, Carol by my side. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I took a deep breath. It felt good to finally be free, to no longer be weighed down by their expectations and their judgment. You know, Carol said, a thoughtful look on her face. For a moment there, I thought your mom was going to have a stroke. I chuckled. She probably wanted to. So, Carol continued, what now? I shrugged. Now, I go back to my life, the one I built for myself without their help or approval. And maybe, just maybe, they'll finally realize that I was never the problem. They were. We walked in silence for a few moments, the only sound the crunching of leaves under our feet. Then, Carol stopped and turned to me, a warm smile on her face. I'm proud of you, Ethan, she said, her voice sincere. You did what you had to do, and you did it with courage. Her words meant more to me than she could possibly know. I smiled back at her, a genuine smile this time. Thanks, Aunt Carol. It means a lot. As I drove away from the country club, leaving the chaos and the shattered remnants of my brother's wedding behind, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The years of resentment and anger were finally starting to fade. I had spoken my truth, and that was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own destiny. And that, I realized, was the greatest success of all.